Some crimes are not buried in earth or time, but in fire. It begins with a missing heir, a scorched hearth, and a gold ring that refused to burn. Beneath the charred remains of a forgotten room, Holmes uncovers a truth that ash could not conceal, and a will someone tried to erase with flame. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Trace the cold outlines of guilt with us as we turn the page on the ring found in the fire. It was on a windless morning in early November that Holmes re-entered our shared rooms at Baker Street, with the scent of char clinging faintly to his overcoat. His boots bore dark traces of soot, and the right cuff of his grey sleeve had been singed to a black edge. He said nothing upon entry, nor did he acknowledge my presence at first. Instead, he crossed directly to the window, lifted the blind with 2 fingers, and regarded the street below with a composure that struck me as vaguely unnatural. There was in his movements that day a quietude I had come to associate with his most strenuous exertions, a silence born not of calm, but of intense internal activity. When at last he turned to me, I observed a faint abrasion at the edge of his jawline, as if he had brushed against hot brick or rough stone. He removed his gloves slowly and with deliberation, revealing fingers smudged with grey ash. "You've returned early," I said, uncertain whether I ought to press him. "Earlier than expected," he replied mildly, removing his coat and hanging it with care. Though not, I believe, before the fire had said all it wished to say. The silence persisted a moment longer as I returned to my breakfast, or rather to what remained of it. My teacup had long gone cold, and the toast on my plate was untouched, save for the corner I had broken absent-mindedly and not consumed. A copy of the Times lay beside my plate, folded in half and crumpled at the edge, a smudge of ink on the page from my thumb. "You did not sleep," Holmes observed quietly, lowering himself into his armchair. "Indeed, I did not," I admitted, somewhat startled by the precision of the remark. He gestured almost lazily toward the items before me. "Your toast has curled at the edges, which suggests it was left to the steam too long without attention. The tea is uncoloured, steeped too briefly, likely in impatience. The print on your thumb confirms that you have read the same article repeatedly, rather than paging through the rest." I gave a small laugh in spite of myself. "One day, Holmes, I shall learn to stop being surprised by you." "One day, perhaps," he said, "but not today." With no further preamble, Holmes reached into the pocket of his coat and retrieved a small object, wrapped loosely in a square of char-stained muslin. He placed it on the table between us, with a gesture so delicate it seemed more fitting for a surgical instrument than an item from the hearth. Then, wordlessly, he unwrapped the cloth and let its contents speak for themselves. Upon the linen lay a ring, or rather the twisted remnant of one. It had clearly once been of fine craftsmanship, though now it bore the cruel warping of intense heat. The band was partially melted and blackened at the seams, and yet a single small ruby still clung to its setting, defiant and oddly luminous against the scorched gold. I leaned closer, careful not to touch it. "From a fire." Holmes inclined his head. "Pulled from the cinders of a fireplace in Brixton, not a fragment of bone or fabric near it, only this." "Whose was it?" I asked. "That," he replied, folding his hands in his lap, "is precisely what remains to be determined." There was something in his tone, not excitement, nor urgency, but rather a sombre gravity, that led me to believe the ring had not merely survived the fire. It had emerged with a story to tell. I waited for Holmes to offer more, but he did not. Instead, he gazed at the ring with the abstract intensity of one observing a specimen beneath glass. At length, I said gently, "And what brought you to Brixton so early this morning?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He took up his pipe, struck a match, and allowed the flame to flicker a moment before extinguishing it, unused. Then he turned his eyes to me, and in them I detected something rare, not uncertainty, but restraint. "There was a whisper of something last night," he said at last. A faint call, not from a client, but from a silence too loud to ignore. I acted on instinct, which I confess I seldom permit myself. Yet when I arrived at the address in question, the hearth was still warm. He tapped the ash from his fingertips, as if recalling its texture. It is a peculiar thing, Watson, to find a fire that has only recently spoken, and yet said nothing aloud. Is it murder? I asked. He smiled faintly, though his eyes did not. It may yet be, or it may be something older, something smothered too long. Either way, the flame tried to forget, but the ring remembered. It was just past 11 when Mrs. Hudson appeared at our parlour door, her expression bearing a shade of concern reserved for visitors whose troubles had impressed even her seasoned sensibilities. "A young lady, sir," she murmured, "and she seems quite shaken." She entered almost at once behind her announcement. The woman before us could not have been more than 25, though grief had already etched premature shadows beneath her eyes. Her attire, modest but well kept, bore the signs of a hurried journey, hem dampened by the London streets, gloves crumpled in one hand, bonnet askew. "I beg your pardon for intruding unannounced," she said breathlessly, "but I have been told, by a clerk at Scotland Yard no less, that if anyone can help me, it is Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Then I trust he did not mislead you. Please be seated, Miss Hargrove, Eleanor Hargrove." She seated herself with visible effort, and though her posture was correct and her manner composed, I observed her gloved hands trembling as they folded into her lap. Holmes regarded her with quiet patience, his gaze not unkind, but searching, as one might watch the first stirrings of a storm upon a still lake. "I have come," she began, "because the man I was to marry has disappeared." Holmes nodded gently. "Please proceed." "His name is Nathaniel Linley. He is, or rather was, a solicitor with offices on Belgrave Road. We were to be wed yesterday morning at St. Jude's in Brixton. The banns had been read, the invitations dispatched, and my gown hung in readiness." Her voice faltered, then steadied. "He was to call upon me the evening before the ceremony, as custom permitted. Instead, he wrote to say that he must visit the house of his late father. A matter of private business, he called it." "And what hour was that?" Holmes asked. "Just before 8. He had dined already and said he would not be long. But he did not return. At first, I feared some accident, and I waited, sleepless through the night. In the morning, I inquired at the Linley house. They claimed not to have seen him at all." Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. "And did you believe them?" "I did not," she said quietly. "Nathaniel was not a man to vanish without word. He seemed withdrawn of late, yes, but never cruel, never careless." "And you are certain he went to the house?" "I am," she replied, "for I followed." At this, even Holmes stirred. "You followed him?" "I did," she said, "and what I found there, Mr. Holmes, it chilled me more than his silence ever could." Eleanor drew in a breath, as if bracing against the memory. "When I reached the Linley house, the front steps were still wet from the rain, but the upper windows were lit. I did not ring the bell. I merely waited across the lane, hoping to glimpse Nathaniel at the door." "But he never emerged?" I prompted. She shook her head. "No. After an hour, the lights were extinguished, and the house lay still. I returned in the morning under the guise of a call. The maid who answered looked as though she had not slept. When I asked for Mr. Nathaniel, she stammered that he had not visited. But I knew better." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "What did you find?" "I asked to use the drawing room, as I had done many times before. They could hardly refuse. The fireplace had been used recently. I could feel warmth still emanating from the hearthstone, and the smell. Oh, the smell, Doctor. It was not the scent of a fire for comfort, but something fouler, like burned cloth, and something else. She paused before continuing. I knelt when they were not looking. In the ash, I found a man's cravat, scorched and twisted, and near it, the edge of an envelope. Sealed, but now blackened beyond reading. And then, I saw it. The ring, half melted, but unmistakably his. Holmes did not speak. He merely reached into the drawer beside him and laid the same ring, wrapped in muslin, upon the table before her. Her hands flew to her mouth. Yes, that is it. How did you... I retrieved it early this morning, Holmes said evenly. And you are right, Miss Hargrove. It is not the remnant of an accident. It is the relic of intention. Eleanor's eyes filled, but she mastered herself with remarkable composure. Then he was there. I knew it, I ventured, and yet the family deny it still. They do, she said bitterly, with smiles no less. Mrs. Linley, the widow, expressed surprise at my visit, but no concern for her missing son. She remarked with a curious air that weddings often made men skittish, and perhaps Nathaniel had thought twice. As for his younger cousin Felix, he offered me brandy and suggested Nathaniel had eloped. Eloped, I echoed. To where, I wonder? Eleanor asked coldly. With whom? He was never unfaithful, never thoughtless, but lately he was frightened. I saw it in him. I asked him what troubled him, and he said only, "There are papers that must not be seen." Holmes's brow furrowed. Did he speak of any threat? Only in silence. He watched his own shadow, and he told me, quite softly, that the house had grown colder since his brother died. Holmes exchanged a glance with me, one that required no words. A house that grows cold may yet burn, but not without leaving its trace. For a time, no one spoke. Holmes examined the scorched ring once more, then set it gently back into its cloth. Eleanor sat unmoving, her hands folded, her gaze steady despite the shadows that clung to it. There was in her bearing a quiet despair that did not plead, but rather stated its case by its very presence. "You have spoken to the police?" Holmes asked. "I have," she replied. "Inspector Kinloch at Brixton Station. He said," her voice tightened, "he said Nathaniel likely chose not to be found, that such things happen, that perhaps he feared the altar and sought escape. And did he offer any explanation for the warmth of the hearth, or the presence of a ring in the ashes?" Eleanor's voice became a whisper. "He said that young men sometimes part with rings when they change their minds." Holmes exhaled faintly through his nose, the sound he made when suppressing contempt. He rose then and crossed to the window. "I am not inclined to accept the impossible," he said at last, "but I am always intrigued by the improbable. If Mr. Linley's disappearance was an act of fear, we shall find what he feared. If it was an act of harm, we shall find who feared him." He turned back to Eleanor and offered a single nod. "Miss Hargrove, you have come to the right place." We journeyed to the Linley estate 2 mornings later, the mist clinging low over the damp pavements as our hansom rattled southward through the grey hush of the city. Holmes had remained peculiarly silent during the ride, his features composed yet inwardly alight with that singular stillness I had learned to associate with deep mental activity. Though I attempted on 2 occasions to draw him into conversation, his replies were brief and abstract, and I soon abandoned the effort, content to watch the fog roll past the window and wonder what we were soon to find. The Linley house, a sombre Georgian structure set back from the lane, presented a facade both stately and joyless. Its shutters were drawn halfway, and the ivy clinging to its stonework had grown unchecked along the eastern wall. The very air seemed to possess a heaviness not born of weather alone. As we ascended the steps and were admitted by a manservant of unusual solemnity, I found myself afflicted with a curious unease. Not fear precisely, but the hush that precedes the reading of a will or the closing of a coffin. Holmes, by contrast, removed his gloves slowly and said with measured calm, "Let us begin with the parlour. if they will permit it. Always the parlour, Watson. The drawing room into which we were shown bore the genteel marks of a family once possessed of taste, though no longer invested in its maintenance. A pianoforte rested under a cloth faded unevenly by the sun, and the carpet bore the unmistakable pattern of furniture recently rearranged. At the centre of it all yawned the hearth, broad, deep, and lined with white-veined black tile, now dulled by soot. Holmes knelt with careful deliberation, his gaze sweeping the floor before him. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, gesturing to the tiles before the grate. "These scratches, 4 of them, faint but deliberate, begin not at the edge of the fireguard but 2 inches in. Something rested here that should not have." He withdrew his lens and studied the scoring more closely. Heavy, square in outline, possibly a trunk or iron-bound box. I approached. "But why so near the fire?" "Not near," he corrected, "but overlapping. The pattern suggests it was partially inside the grate at some point. Now why would a man place an object part way into a fire unless he intended to burn something within it? Without burning the object itself?" His fingers traced the tilework. "There," he added. "Do you perceive the faint crescent of scorching just shy of the grate? The fire extended further than the wood suggests. Something flared briefly, something that did not belong." He stood slowly, his gaze sweeping upward. "And yet," he said softly, "we have only begun to learn what the fire did not quite destroy." Holmes turned his attention next to the hearth itself, brushing aside the poker and lifting the coal scuttle lid with 2 fingers. "They have made a modest effort to clean," he noted, "but not an industrious one. See here, ashes that are older than the rest, discoloured at the edge. The heat was irregular. Someone was in a hurry." He reached for the tongs and delicately shifted a few of the remaining cinders. Then, with an exhalation no louder than the scratch of a quill, he paused. Nestled beneath the blackened remnants of firewood and a cluster of charred papers lay a small object, half fused to the brick. He withdrew it with the utmost care. It was no larger than a coin, glinting faintly under layers of soot and flake. "A clasp," he said, turning it over. "Or rather, what remains of one. Brass, partially melted. See here, the remnants of fabric where it once held fast." I bent to observe it. "Part of a case?" Unlikely. This was affixed to something smaller, more personal, perhaps the corner of a diary or a gentleman's wallet. He held it up to the light and examined the curvature. The warping suggests intense directional heat, not merely accidental. It was placed deliberately and left to perish. Holmes stepped back from the fire, a shadow passing over his brow. "We shall find nothing more here, not with bare hands." But already I knew from his expression that he had found enough, not what was said, but what had been meant to be silenced. As Holmes stood from the hearth, his fingers still dusted with ash, a quiet cough behind us announced the presence of a man who, until then, had remained just outside our notice. He was tall and lean, with features drawn long by time and habit, his greying hair flattened to a polished shine, and his livery so crisp it seemed almost theatrical. This was the butler, Mr. Greaves, a name we had encountered in Miss Hargreaves' telling, though only in passing. Holmes turned without surprise, his gaze resting on the man's expressionless face. "Mr. Greaves," he said evenly, "you have maintained this household for some years, I believe." 24, sir," came the answer. The voice was soft, cultured, and unyieldingly flat. "You keep your floors well swept," Holmes said, "and your hearths quite lively." There was no reply to this, only a narrowing of the eyes, not hostile, but observant, and with a quality I could not then name. As Greaves turned to leave, Holmes leaned toward me and murmured just audibly, "He is watching what he once did himself, Watson." I looked after the departing figure, the line of his back too rigid, too deliberate. It was not only the fire that left its traces in this house, but also the eyes that had stood too long before it. We were shown next to what had once been Nathaniel Linley's bedroom. It bore the melancholy tidiness common to rooms abandoned in haste. A pair of gloves laid neatly on a desk, the bed covers pulled but unpressed, and a shaving bowl still bearing the faint ring of use. A stack of legal volumes sat beside the window, their bindings well worn. Holmes's attention was drawn immediately to one among them, a Latin compendium of legal maxims whose spine had been cracked open at the midpoint. He lifted it gently and opened the cover. Inside, a jagged edge where several pages had been torn, not cleanly but with an urgency that bespoke secrecy rather than care. He ran his thumb along the margin. "Note the residue here," he said, showing me the faint red flecks embedded in the crease. Wax, and old wax at that. It once sealed something, possibly an amendment, possibly a will. He turned to the writing table, where a stub of candle had been placed on a brass saucer. Holmes bent to it, then removed a small blade from his pocket and gently chipped away at the outer edge of the wax. "It is no ordinary tallow," he observed. "This was poured through a signet. See the curvature? And here, a faint indentation in the residue, though the ring is no longer present." I asked whether the ring in question might have been the very one Eleanor had found. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked about the room, his gaze steady. "No," he said softly, "that ring bore love. This wax sealed something someone never wished to be read." We descended once more to the parlour, where Holmes, without ceremony, requested the presence of Mrs. Linley. She entered a few minutes later, her figure slender and angular, her features arranged in the permanent neutrality of the bereaved, long since accustomed to mourning. She greeted us with the clip courtesy of someone who had already rehearsed the necessary formalities. Holmes inquired, with polite directness, whether she had seen her son on the night of his disappearance. "No," she said at once, "nor had I any reason to expect him. Nathaniel was often private in his comings and goings. A creature of law is not always a creature of habit." "And yet," Holmes said, "he was to marry the following morning." A pause. Then, "Doubtless he needed air." Holmes said nothing to this, but turned his attention to the younger man who had entered with her, Felix Linley, the cousin. He lounged with an air of leisure, arms crossed, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He was nervous, Felix offered. Like most grooms, perhaps he realized too late that love and law seldom mix well. Mrs. Linley gave him a warning glance which he ignored. Holmes's voice remained level. "And Greaves, did he see Mr. Linley that evening?" "No," Mrs. Linley replied. "But you did not ask him." "I did not see the need." Outside, the light dimmed further. Within, the house remained quiet. Too quiet. Holmes turned to me as we stepped back into the corridor. "This is not the silence of grief, Watson," he said. "It is the silence of rehearsal." As we returned from the upstairs corridor, Holmes's stride slowed upon entering the parlour once more. His gaze, which had passed over the chamber with quick precision on our first inspection, now settled upon the wall above the mantel, not upon the hearth, nor upon the arrangement of candelabras, but upon the solitary portrait that loomed above it. It was a sombre oil of a young man, the brushwork precise, though cold. His face, pale and narrow, bore the haughty expression of one who would rather be neither seen nor studied. The eyes, a striking shade of blue, had been rendered with almost photographic realism. Yet there was something in them, some minute discord, that caused me to draw a breath without knowing why. "Julian Linley," Holmes said, confirming the identity without need of introduction. "The elder brother, deceased 2 years this spring." I studied the painting. There's something unnatural in his expression. Holmes stepped forward and tilted his head. "Not the expression, Watson, the alignment." I looked again. The left eye stared directly outward, but the right? It was ever so slightly misaligned, not in its angle, but in its focus. Holmes's hand reached slowly to the frame, as one might lift the lid of a coffin, not entirely convinced of the occupant's slumber. "I wonder," he murmured, "whether Mr. Julian Linley may have observed more in death than he ever dared in life." Holmes's fingers traced the edge of the frame, his touch feather-light, until he found a small hinge, painted over to match the oak panelling, but perceptible to the trained eye. With a delicate pressure, he loosened it, and the entire portrait swung outward on a narrow axis, revealing not blank wall, but a hollowed recess within the panel behind it. Within that recess lay a small square opening, scarcely wider than the man's fist, but deep and perfectly carved. A hole had been bored clean through the interior wall, and though the light from the room did not reach far, I could see plainly enough that it granted a view into the front hallway below. "A peephole," I said, astonished. Holmes nodded, his features grave. "And not an accidental one. This was fashioned deliberately, Watson, and at some cost. The inner angle offers an unobstructed view of the entryway and the drawing-room door. Anyone stationed here would have been able to watch comings and goings without the slightest detection." I stooped beside him. Then someone was spying, perhaps upon Nathaniel himself, or upon what Nathaniel was beginning to uncover. Holmes allowed the frame to swing back into place and stepped away, brushing dust from his sleeve. "That portrait," he said quietly, "was not painted to be admired. It was stationed as a sentinel. A man may die, Watson, but his secrets linger, especially when they were never truly buried to begin with." We encountered Miss Hargrove in the side parlour, seated at a writing desk with a closed notebook before her. She looked up as we entered, and Holmes's countenance, though steady, grew perceptibly more sombre. "Miss Hargrove," he began, "you once said that the house had grown colder since Mr. Julian Linley's death. May I ask what precisely you meant by that?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded once, her voice soft. Julian was a man of solitude. Even as a child, Nathaniel said he preferred shadows to company. He rarely dined with the family, and when he did, he said little. But there was always the sense, Nathaniel described it to me once, that Julian knew more than he let on. Holmes said nothing, allowing the silence to draw her further. "He kept a private study in the West Wing," she continued. "No one was permitted inside, not even the servants. He wrote often, but no one saw the pages. And then, just after the father's death, Julian began to change. He became restless. At night, lights would flicker in that study until dawn. Nathaniel once told me Julian feared something, but whether it was a person or an idea, he never said." "And his death?" Holmes asked. Eleanor's expression darkened. "They said he fell in the woods behind the estate. No one witnessed it. There was no inquest." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A man like Julian does not fall by chance." "Nor," she replied, "does he ever truly vanish." Later that day, Holmes requested from the family a copy of the constabulary report filed at the time of Julian Linley's death. It was produced with a sluggishness that bespoke either indifference or unwillingness, and Holmes perused it with growing distaste as we sat together in the same parlour where the ring had first been discussed. "The body," he read aloud, "was discovered by a groundskeeper at dawn, lying at the base of a slope behind the yew grove. Head trauma, no sign of a struggle. Verdict: accidental fall during a nighttime walk." He closed the folder. "Curious how little the report contains." "Did he often walk alone at night?" I asked. Eleanor, who had remained with us, shook her head. "Not as far as I know, but Julian was a creature of habit. If he did, he never mentioned it, and certainly not through the grove. The terrain is uneven, even treacherous in parts." Holmes looked again at the report, then to me. "And yet the man leaves no note, no explanation, no disturbed earth at the edge of the fall." I frowned. "Then you believe it was not an accident?" "I believe," he said, "that there was no effort to prove otherwise." He turned to Eleanor. "Were any of Julian's papers examined after his death?" Only those in his desk. The study was locked. They said it was empty. They said, Holmes repeated. But so far, they have said a great many things. Outside the window, a wind had begun to stir the trees. Not yet a storm, but the whisper of one preparing its voice. That evening, Holmes and I were lodged in a modest guest room overlooking the side lawn. The house had retired early. The hallways were dark by 10, and the hush that descended felt more monastic than domestic. I had begun to pen my notes of the day's events when Holmes, who had been seated near the window, raised a hand to silence me. "Watson," he said quietly, "come here." I rose and joined him. He pointed through the glass, his finger steady. There, at the edge of the garden hedge, just beyond the border of the moon's reach, stood a figure, motionless and half-shadowed, but plainly watching the window of the east bedroom. Eleanor's window. We observed in silence. The figure did not move, nor did it appear to breathe with visible rhythm. It stood not like a man spying, but like one waiting. For what? I could not guess. After several minutes it withdrew into the trees, silent as mist. Holmes did not speak for some time. When he did, his voice was low. "Either the dead have taken to wandering, Watson, or the living have become very good at pretending so." And as I looked out again into the wavering dark, I felt for the first time in many weeks the cold touch of something older than fear, the dreadful certainty that what we were chasing had already begun to chase us. The following morning found Holmes in one of his more restive moods. He rose early, refused both breakfast and conversation, and devoted himself to pacing the garden walk with his hands clasped tightly behind his back. At 9:30, he informed the household that he had observed a draught in the east chimney that might well prove dangerous, and insisted that he be permitted to inspect the flue from below. This pronouncement, accompanied by the full weight of Holmes's practiced authority, stirred the household into a minor commotion. The cook fretted about smoke in the scullery. Mrs. Linley sent for the gardener, and Greaves, looking more perturbed than I had yet seen him, volunteered to assist. Holmes declined his company and requested only that no fire be lit in the drawing-room until his inspection was complete. As the household dispersed, Holmes turned to me with a faint smile. "Sometimes, Watson, the key to opening a door lies not in the handle, but in where all eyes are not." He descended into the cellar with only a lantern and a pair of gloves. I remained above, feigning idle interest in the design of the parlour fireplace, all the while listening for the faintest echo of Holmes's footsteps below. Whatever he expected to find in the bowels of that house, he intended to do so without the observation of those who had grown too accustomed to hiding things above ground. And in truth, it was in darkness that the evidence had waited longest. When Holmes re-emerged some 20 minutes later, he bore the look of a man who had found precisely what he had anticipated, and not liked it. His coat bore fresh dust, and his gloves, though carefully removed, held a faint char at the fingertips. He said nothing until we had returned to our room. "There is a second hearth," he said, "beneath the drawing-room, in the cellar wall. Old brickwork, likely predating the upper renovation. It has not been used regularly, but recently it has seen fire." I stared. So a second fire was lit, not above, but below. Indeed, the ashes heavier, less sifted by time, and the timber was of a different cut entirely. Oak, perhaps salvaged from a crate or cabinet. I also discovered traces of cloth, singed but unmistakably wool. And Watson, he paused. There were remnants of a lockbox hinge, warped by heat but intact in its outline. He lowered his voice. This was no careless disposal. It was calculated. The fire in the parlour was a theatre, but the fire below was a furnace. A place where something meant to vanish was deliberately fed to flame. I felt a chill despite myself. And what, I asked, could merit such secret combustion? Holmes looked toward the window. Whatever it was, it bore a weight its possessor could not carry. And so He consigned it to a place where only the dust might speak. We had scarcely finished speaking when the house was riven by a scream so sudden, so anguished, that I found myself halfway to the staircase before Holmes had even reached the door. It came from the east wing, Eleanor's room. We were not alone in our response. Footsteps sounded from every quarter. Felix appeared from the gallery, Mrs. Linley from the rear hall. But Holmes was first to reach her. Eleanor stood at the foot of her bed, her hands trembling, her breath ragged. At her feet lay an open trunk, her own, which she had packed only days earlier in anticipation of her wedding. And within it, a scorched bundle of men's garments, a cravat, a waistcoat, and what might once have been a monogrammed handkerchief, now blackened almost beyond recognition. "It was not here before," she whispered. "I packed that trunk myself." Holmes bent swiftly, his hands gloved. This was placed within the past day. The ash is fresh. And see here. He lifted a scrap of burned linen. This bears the same odour as the hearth below. Whoever placed this wished to frighten you, and perhaps implicate another. Felix scoffed from the door. A lover's melodrama, no doubt. Holmes turned a cold eye upon him. "Sir," he said evenly, "if this is melodrama, then someone in this house is writing with fire. And fire, Mr. Linley, is rarely theatrical for long. It burns through." Holmes, without delay, requested the presence of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, who arrived that same afternoon with his usual brisk efficiency and a thin layer of London soot on his coat. Though the man had ever been sceptical of Holmes's methods, he had long since learned to defer when the evidence inclined toward the extraordinary. Holmes greeted him without ceremony and led him directly to the cellar. Upon returning, Lestrade's face bore the grim cast of official suspicion. "Well," he muttered, "we've had murders with no motive, and motives with no murder, but this one feels like both, and buried under stone." He turned to Eleanor with a measure of gentleness I had not seen in him before. "Miss Hargrove, I'd ask that you remain under protection here until we know more. This is no longer a matter of a missing man. There's a clear intent to threaten," Holmes added, "and to conceal. The fires are not the end, Lestrade. They are the middle. What we have yet to uncover may still lie deeper." Lestrade nodded curtly. "Then let's see what the grounds have to say." And with that, he called for the constables and ordered a sweep of the estate, every stone, hedge, and boundary wall. It was not long before the land itself gave up what the house would not. The shallow depression lay behind the south orchard, just beyond the hedgerow, where Holmes and I had once glimpsed a solitary figure under moonlight. It was a gardener's dog who first disturbed the earth, its paws unearthing a corner of discoloured cloth. The constables completed the task in solemn silence. Beneath the loam and rotted leaves lay a man's remains, clothed in the remnants of a dark coat, the fabric stiff with time and soil. His face, though partially preserved by the cold, bore unmistakable features. It was Julian Linley. Eleanor gasped. Felix turned pale. Even Mrs. Linley gripped the chair beside her. "But he was buried 2 years ago," someone whispered. Holmes answered quietly, "No, he was said to have fallen, but no one saw his body. The coffin, I suspect, was filled with stone or straw." Lestrade stepped back from the grave, frowning. "Then the man who died only recently?" Holmes nodded. "And the question now is not only who killed, but who pretended to be dead." I looked once more at the corpse. Not the ghost we had imagined, nor the spectre Eleanor feared, but a man whose death had been used as a stage, a mask for something still alive. And suddenly, the flames in the parlour seemed far too small for the lies they were meant to consume. In the wake of the discovery near the orchard, Holmes requested access to the estate's architectural records, which were, after some persuasion, produced from a lacquered cabinet in the study. I watched as he unrolled the brittle blue sheets across the writing table, his eyes narrowing with the particular gleam they acquired when a map, a pattern, or a contradiction lay before him. The drawing room, he murmured, pointing with the end of his pencil, adjoins what is marked here as a servant's washroom. But note, this passage, he traced it slowly, was bricked off in the last renovation. According to the dimensions, the wall now occupies a space that once opened directly into a narrow chamber. I leaned closer, and yet there's no mention of its removal. Precisely, he said. Furthermore, the chimney stack servicing the drawing room is flanked by what appears to be a false vent, unused, yet connected to nothing below. Tell me, Watson, have you ever known a chimney that draws without a grate? I have not. Holmes stood, folding the blueprint with care. Then we must assume the hearth above is not the only one that smouldered, or was meant to. There was an energy about him then, not of anger, but of precision, the controlled charge of a man who sees that the house has not been constructed to keep people warm, but rather to keep something buried. That afternoon, under the pretext of measuring heat distribution for the inspector's report, Holmes conducted a methodical examination of the drawing room's outer structure. I accompanied him under the guise of recording notes, though I confess my observations were largely directed by Holmes's silent gestures and occasional murmured insight. He tapped at the brickwork beneath the eastern sill, pausing when his knuckles met an unexpected hollowness. Here, he said, the resonance differs. This brick has not weathered like the others. It is newer, likely installed within the past 2 years. He then stepped back and pointed toward the chimney flue above. Observe the angle. It deviates from the vertical. The stack was altered, perhaps rerouted. A false shaft, Watson, sufficient to suggest ventilation, but designed never to draw. But why construct such a deception? I asked. Because, he said, to an idle glance, the hearth appears functional. It has ash, a scent of smoke, even heat at its edge. But the fire burns elsewhere. This is not a grate. It is a theatre. We returned inside. Holmes examined the hearth once more, kneeling where he had before, this time inspecting the interior bricks. He touched one gently and withdrew his hand. Still warm, but not from within. I did not speak. There was, in that moment, a stillness, not of quietude, but anticipation, the kind one feels before a confession not yet spoken aloud. That evening, Holmes informed the household that he required solitude to compile his findings, and that no one was to disturb him. In truth, we had concealed ourselves within the shadowed alcove, adjacent to the bricked-off passage, a space so narrow that my shoulder pressed against the lath, and my knees ached from their confinement. Holmes, however, was composed as ever. He had brought no lantern, relying instead upon the sliver of moonlight that filtered through the stained glass above the stairwell. Time passed in heavy increments. I could hear the ticking of the hallway clock, measured, implacable, faintly accusatory. Holmes whispered, "We are not merely waiting, Watson. We are listening. Guilt speaks in movement. It hesitates, retraces its steps." And indeed, sometime after midnight, we heard it. A soft tread upon the stair, a creak along the boards. Then, silence. Holmes inclined his head. He knew the rhythm of men who walk with purpose, and those who walk with fear. A moment later, we heard the faint metallic clink of a key, then the scrape of a hidden door opening within the wall, precisely where Holmes had marked it on the blueprint. Holmes's hand touched my arm briefly. "Now," he said, "we must let the act play, for only then can the curtain be drawn upon its author." We waited, breath low, as the fire that was never meant to be seen was lit once more. From the narrow passage, we beheld a dim glow cast upon the wall, flickering from a source just beyond our sight. The unmistakable crackle of kindling confirmed what Holmes had predicted. A second fire, deliberately kindled. We eased forward soundlessly. Through the thin seam between boards, I saw him. Mr. Greaves stood in the centre of the hidden chamber, his face half lit by the small flame he had just coaxed to life. In his hands he held a folded parchment sealed in red wax. His fingers trembled, Yet his expression bore not remorse, but urgency, the desperation of a man who fears not punishment but discovery. With a single movement, he cast the envelope into the flames. It curled, blistered, and blackened within seconds. But Greaves did not leave. Instead, he reached into his coat once more and produced a second object, a watch, gold, of the type common to gentlemen of means. It bore an engraving on its cover. Holmes drew in a breath beside me. "Too late for modest concealment," he whispered. "He is cleansing his sins with fire." The servant lingered, as if to ensure the flames did their work, then turned to extinguish the embers. But it was at that moment Holmes stepped forward. "Mr. Greaves," he said, his voice as cold as the stone beneath us, "you have been faithful to the dead, but now I ask you to speak for the living." The man froze, his hand still inches from the flame. Greaves did not turn immediately. Instead, he remained still, one hand hovering above the blaze, the other clenched tightly at his side. When at last he faced us, the light revealed the truth that his composure had long concealed. The tremor at the jaw, the sweat upon his brow, the hollowness of a man undone not by confrontation, but by conscience long held at bay. Holmes stepped forward and retrieved the charred remnants with iron tongs. The watch was half melted, but its engraving, JL, was still faintly legible. The parchment, though blackened, bore the seal of Julian Linley's solicitor. "A second will," Holmes said quietly, "or perhaps an earlier one that did not suit the house's current heirs." Greaves sagged against the wall. "I did not mean for him to die," he whispered. "He came with questions. He had found something in the study. I tried to frighten him. That was all, just to buy time. But he confronted me, and I—" He sank to his knees. Holmes said nothing. There was no triumph in his eyes, only the solemn confirmation of what he had long suspected. "You were burning the evidence," I said. Greaves nodded. "And the ring?" He looked up, eyes hollow. "I thought it would melt." Holmes stepped back. "Gold may burn," he said, "but not without protest, and certainly not without memory." The silence that followed was not of shock. It was the silence of final understanding. Mr. Greaves stood transfixed, as Holmes withdrew from the hearth the smouldering remnants that had not yet yielded fully to flame. The charred watch lay curled like a blackened petal, its gilded face fractured by heat, but still bearing the faint curve of its owner's monogram. The edges of the parchment were seared to the point of illegibility, but the seal, though cracked, remained discernible. The sigil of the Linleys' solicitor. "You attempted to erase not a man," Holmes said quietly, "but his inheritance." Greaves lowered his gaze, his composure eroding by slow degrees. His hands, those long, capable hands that had once served brandy and opened letters with ceremonial elegance, now shook at his sides. "I only meant to delay him," he whispered, "to stop the documents from reaching Eleanor. He had found the envelope in Julian's books. He said he intended to tell her that evening. I thought, if I could destroy the proof—" He faltered. Holmes's voice remained level. "And when he resisted, there was a struggle. It was not supposed to. I did not mean for it to end as it did." The flames crackled beside us, as though echoing the finality of that statement. Holmes glanced at me and then to Lestrade, who stood now in the doorway, silent but no longer doubtful. Truth, once ignited, cannot be extinguished with cinders. Under the weight of evidence and the grave stillness of the room, Greaves spoke at last with the slow cadence of a man who had rehearsed his silence, but never his guilt. "Mr. Julian revised his will after his father's passing," he said. "He had grown distant from the family, Felix especially. It was Nathaniel he trusted, despite their differences. The new document named Nathaniel sole heir to the estate and its holdings." Holmes folded his arms, the firelight catching the sharp glint in his eye. "But that version was never filed." "No," Greaves replied. "Julian placed it inside a book, the Latin volume in the study. He intended to present it when the time was right. And instead, Holmes said, he fell. Greaves did not answer. Holmes pressed no further. So Nathaniel discovered the will recently, and you, fearing the consequences of a transfer in power, sought to suppress it. I did not wish the estate to fall into unfamiliar hands. The family, they had relied on me. They trusted me. No, Holmes corrected him gently. They used you, and when it came to it, you chose their comfort over a man's life. The butler said nothing more. Outside, the wind stirred faintly through the chimney, a hollow moan like breath rising through stone. Holmes stepped forward and retrieved the battered legal volume from the hearthside table where it had lain since our first visit. With deft fingers, he turned its pages until he reached the jagged scar left by the torn leaves. These pages, he said, once held the amended will. You tore them out, but not before Nathaniel had read them, and more to the point, not before he had recognized something was amiss. Holmes opened a drawer and drew forth a signet ring, cracked at the shoulder but still intact. He held it beside the candle whose wax had sealed the vanished parchment. The seal had been tampered with. The wax, faintly embedded with this ring, had cooled unevenly. Nathaniel deduced that someone had altered the binding. The forgery was subtle, but not subtle enough. Greaves looked down. He confronted me, he said again. He demanded the truth. I told him it was better forgotten, that no one would believe him. He said he would show Eleanor. Holmes's gaze darkened. And so you tried to destroy the only proof he had. I thought, Greaves whispered, if it was gone, the doubt would be enough. But doubt, Holmes said, is not the same as silence, and silence, as you have learned, does not endure. Holmes took the scorched gold ring from the velvet pouch in which he had preserved it since that first morning. He laid it upon the desk, its warped band and crimson stone gleaming faintly under the lamplight, half ruined, yet oddly dignified. This, he said, was never intended for the flames. It was meant for a hand. Greaves did not speak, but his eyes flicked toward the ring with something close to recognition. It was found in the ashes of the parlour hearth, Holmes continued. You believed it had melted fully, that it would disappear along with the rest. But gold, Mr. Greaves, does not surrender so easily. This particular band was traced by its hallmark to Abram and Levins of Cheapside, a maker known for alloying heirlooms with trace copper to preserve their form. It bore the Linley crest on the inner rim, now nearly unreadable, but not entirely so. Holmes's voice lowered. You tried to erase what Nathaniel held most dear. A will, yes, but also a symbol, a promise. Greaves looked at the floor. I found it in his coat afterwards. I thought if it burned, she would never know. Holmes stared at the flame. But she did know, because grief speaks even when the mouth is closed, and love leaves a trace, even in ash. When Eleanor entered the room, she did so with quiet dignity, her gloved hands folded before her, her veil lifted though her eyes remained dark with shadow. Holmes said nothing as she approached, only turned slightly to let her see what had lay upon the desk, the half-burned will, the melted watch, and the twisted ring that had once been hers to wear. She looked at each in turn, and then at Greaves, who now sat slumped in the chair, aged 10 years by truth. His eyes lifted to meet hers. I meant only to keep the house as it was, he said, his voice hoarse. I thought, if he disappeared, the family would not suffer. You would move on, and no one need know what Julian intended. Eleanor's gaze did not soften. You let me believe he abandoned me. Greaves bowed his head. I only wanted quiet, he murmured. You gave us silence, she said, but not peace. Holmes touched her shoulder lightly, a rare gesture. It is done, he said. The fire has finished its work. The rest belongs to daylight. Eleanor said nothing more. She turned from the table and walked out into the hall, and as she passed from view, I thought of the ring, once whole, then scorched, and how, though bent, it had outlasted the lies meant to destroy it. It was later that evening, as we sat once more within the study, the storm outside now reduced to a weary drizzle, that Holmes began his final summation. There was no theatricality to his bearing, no indulgence in drama, only that still intensity which always attended his clearest moments of reasoning. "You see, Watson," he began, "each element of this affair, when examined singly, offered little of substance. A man vanishes, a fire is lit, a will is unread, and a ring is found where it ought not to be. But when these ashes are sifted together, one discerns a pattern. He spread before us the architectural plans of the Linley estate, which he had acquired from the county registrar earlier that day. His finger traced the drawing-room wall. This false chimney, he said, was constructed during Julian's renovations 5 years ago. Note the sealed recess behind it, which would have allowed for the concealment of objects, or indeed the staging of a fire, without alerting the household." I leaned forward. The hollow sounded beneath his tapping knuckle. It was here that the amended will was burned. Not in the parlour. Not in the grate. Here, where the smoke could mimic the scent of a hearth, yet disguise the crime entirely. "And the ring?" I asked. "Recovered from the wrong fire, but pointing to the right one." He leaned back, satisfied. "The architecture, Watson, gave them the illusion, but it was the ash that gave them away." And with that, he gestured for me to attend to the next question, still smouldering in the air. Holmes took the half-melted ring in hand once more, studying its scorched contour as one might a fragment of a coded message. His tone, though subdued, was tinged with a grave admiration, not for the crime, but for the audacity of its concealment. "Fire is a most persuasive liar," he said. "It devours without partiality and convinces the eye of absence where once there was form. But it is precisely this power which tempts men to over-rely upon it. They forget that fire also illuminates." I nodded. "And yet it nearly worked." "Quite nearly," he agreed. "Had the document been parchment rather than paper, it may have disintegrated utterly. Had the ring been of purer gold, it might have flowed to nothing in the flame. But as it was, flawed materials preserved a flawed plan." He set the ring beside the melted watch. "These remnants were meant to vanish, but instead they became evidence. The smoke was intended to deceive, to mask a destruction so complete that no trace of intention could be gleaned. And yet there was always something left. A curl of wax, a seam of solder, a scent of linen." Holmes turned toward me. "Even the cleverest arsonist forgets that fire has memory." Outside, the wind sighed faintly through the old chimneys of Linley Hall, as if the house itself, weary of its secrets, had begun at last to exhale. But Holmes had not yet finished. He reached into his coat pocket with a final piece of the puzzle. Holmes withdrew from his coat a small leather pouch, worn smooth by time, and stained at one corner with a rust-like smear. From within, he produced a folded handkerchief, and within that, the ring. Its warped surface still bore, faintly, the crest of Linley. "It was not simply an heirloom," he said quietly. "It was a betrothal ring, commissioned by Nathaniel 2 months before his death, or rather, his disappearance. I found the receipt among the solicitor's files, addressed to a London goldsmith, and dated precisely 6 weeks before the fire." I looked at Eleanor, who sat unmoving by the window, her eyes unreadable in the soft lamplight. Holmes continued. "It was meant for Miss Eleanor. Nathaniel had intended to propose that very night. The ring had been placed in the inner breast pocket of his coat. It was only when I examined the burnt remnants thoroughly that I discovered the deformity, not total, but sufficient to conceal it at first glance." Eleanor drew a breath, sharp and sudden. Holmes did not look at her. He gazed into the middle distance, as though through the smoke itself. "He died with it upon him," he said. And Greaves, whether out of guilt or panic, sought to destroy it along with the rest, but the flame refused to finish the task. No one spoke. The truth, long buried and half burned, now lay uncovered, not whole, but enough. And in that silence, I found myself unable to meet Eleanor's gaze. There are griefs too intimate to witness uninvited. That night, as Holmes dozed in the high-backed chair, and the hearth crackled its gentle symphony of orange and coal, I found myself staring into the flames, not with the curiosity of a physician nor the awe of a witness, but with something deeper, something unresolved. What is it in us, I wondered, that makes us turn to fire when truth becomes unbearable? Greaves had not set out to murder, that much I believed, but in his desperation to preserve order, to shelter a house, a name, a legacy, he had allowed logic to harden into cruelty. The flame had been his answer, silent, efficient, final, a cleansing force. And yet it had betrayed him. Holmes stirred, as if sensing the weight of my thought. "Guilt, Watson," he murmured, eyes still closed, "seeks fire the way moths do, not to destroy what is real, but to make it look accidental." I nodded, though he could not see it. Nathaniel had died for a secret he meant to reveal. Eleanor had grieved a silence that need not have been. And Greaves, once trusted, once invisible, had become both instrument and author of the very silence he feared. As I rose to extinguish the lamp, I glanced once more at the hearth. Its warmth lingered, but the truth it had once devoured now lingered too. Charred, yes, but unconsumed. Some truths, I thought, do not burn. They smoulder. And in that low glow, the case of the ring that would not burn reached its quiet, smouldering end. The fog had returned to Baker Street, pressing itself like a damp and brooding thought against the windows. I remember that night well, not for what was said, but for the curious silence that settled upon our rooms, like the very mist beyond the panes. The fire was low, the lamp turned down to a modest glow, and Holmes sat in his usual chair, one leg crossed over the other, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. There was no pipe between his lips that evening, no idle deductions offered, no remarks about the movements of our neighbours or the politics of the day. He stared into the embers with such stillness that I, seated not far from him, refrained from breaking it with a question. I had long grown used to his silences. They were often the birthplace of insight, yet this one carried the peculiar weight of finality, not fatigue, nor mere reflection, but something sterner. He looked not into the hearth, but into some inward image only he could see. Behind us, the world of hansoms and market cries fell away into the muffled hush of London's night. And there, in the hush of our sitting room, I understood. The case was over, yes, but it had left behind an echo. And echoes, unlike flames, are not so easily quenched. "Watson," Holmes said at length, without turning his gaze from the hearth, "have you ever noticed how fire draws a peculiar reverence from men, as though it were a thing of divine forgetfulness?" I was startled by the suddenness of his voice, but I nodded. "It destroys with such thoroughness that one is tempted to believe nothing can survive it. And yet," he continued softly, "ash remains." He reached forward and, with the poker, disturbed a log. A flurry of grey-white dust rose and curled into the air, momentarily catching the light. "There are crimes," he said, "so desperate that their perpetrators seek erasure, not concealment. They do not wish to hide, but to obliterate. The will, the watch, the ring. Greaves did not merely wish the evidence removed. He wished it undone, as though it had never been. But ash is stubborn, Watson. It forgets nothing. Its silence is that of a witness, not a void." I was struck then, not by the cleverness of his reasoning, though it was, as ever, unimpeachable, but by the sadness beneath it. For a man so devoted to fact, Holmes spoke with something dangerously close to feeling. He turned to me at last. "What fire could purge such guilt?" he asked, not seeking an answer. I had none to give, only the quiet conviction that some guilt, once lit, never cools. It lingers, cold and unburned, among the ashes. I could not help but glance toward the small walnut box upon the mantel, the one in which Holmes had placed the scorched ring after our return from Linley Hall. Its lid remained closed, yet my mind saw it clearly. The bent gold, the half-melted crest, the stubborn survival of a promise never fulfilled. "I wonder," I murmured, more to myself than to Holmes, "how many truths lie waiting in burnt corners and locked drawers? How many rings were never worn, not because love failed, but because guilt intervened?" Holmes said nothing, though I saw the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth, that smallest sign of assent. It was not merely the tragedy of the case that lingered with me, but the peculiar melancholy of its symbols. A ring, after all, is meant to endure. It signifies union, loyalty, hope, and in this case, all three had been smothered before they could take breath. Eleanor would never wear it. Nathaniel would never speak. Greaves, though broken, had named only the fire as his accomplice. And so I wondered, as men do in the quieter hours, how many objects the world regards as lost are, in truth, preserved only by the reluctance of others to remember them. Some crimes are not hidden. They are simply unnamed. Holmes rose without warning and walked to the violin case near the window. He opened it with his usual care, selected the instrument, and began to play. The melody was soft and minor, as though it had not yet decided whether it wished to mourn or merely observe. I returned to my desk and picked up my pen. In the fire's glow and the music's quiet cry, I wrote the final lines of the account now before you. A case that began with a missing man and a hearth too hot for its season, and ended with a ring that refused to perish. It had not been the most intricate of our adventures, nor the most perilous, but it had, perhaps, touched more closely upon the fragile threads that bind people to one another. Trust, concealment, grief, and the desperate hope that some things might be forgotten. Holmes played on, his eyes half closed, as though drawing from the strings not a tune, but an echo of what had passed. Outside, the fog still pressed at the glass. I set down my pen. There are flames that cleanse, others that consume. But guilt, true guilt, burns cold and does not fade, and so ends the matter of the ring found in the fire and the silence that followed. As the fire in our hearth dwindled to faint embers, Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "the cleverest deceptions are not those hidden in darkness, but those consumed by light. Fire does not obliterate guilt. It merely bakes it into the walls." He paused, eyes distant. "Even the fiercest flame cannot silence what was meant to endure. What do you think truly betrayed Mr. Greaves in the end? The heirloom ring, the false chimney, or his conscience? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this unravelling of guilt and ash, do like, subscribe, and pass the story along to fellow mystery lovers. The next deduction awaits.